As you settle into a comfortable position and let the noise of the day fade slowly into the background, we begin a quiet journey into one of the most defining chapters in human history. This is the story of World War II, told softly, gently, and continuously, so you can relax, unwind, or drift into sleep as the past unfolds in calm waves. Before we begin, I want to take a moment very gently to remind you that if you enjoy peaceful, sleep-friendly history videos like this one, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps the channel grow and allows you to join us on many more calming journeys through time. And now, we begin. The story of the Second World War begins in the quiet years after the First, a time when many nations were still healing. Europe was a continent of memories, scars, and fragile hopes. Economies struggled, and the world was still learning the lessons of the devastation that had come before. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles left deep resentments as borders shifted, empires collapsed, and pride was wounded. Into this atmosphere, new leaders began to rise, promising renewal and strength. In the early 1930s, Germany experienced political upheaval. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, gained influence, appealing to national pride and promising to restore what had been lost. At the same time, Japan was expanding its influence in Asia, seeking resources and territory. Italy, too, under Mussolini, was pursuing ambitions abroad. The world was, unknowingly, standing at the edge of a vast storm. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the opening of a global conflict. On a quiet morning, German forces crossed the border with swift and coordinated attacks. Tanks rolled across fields, aircraft flew overhead, and the people of Poland faced a terrifying new reality. Nations watched with growing concern as alliances were tested. Soon after, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world had shifted. The seeds of conflict were now fully sown. This first movement of the war was swift. Armies advanced, cities were occupied, and entire regions felt the tension of occupation. In Scandinavia and Western Europe, neutrality was tested, and strategies were formed in quiet rooms, far from the front lines. In these early days, the world was learning that modern warfare was faster, more destructive, and more complex than ever before. The decisions made by leaders in this period would echo through the coming years, shaping battles and determining fates. Meanwhile, across oceans, the United States watched cautiously, hesitant to intervene, but aware that events in Europe and Asia could not remain distant forever. The stage was set, nations prepared, quietly, for a conflict that would touch nearly every corner of the globe. Armies grew, strategies were refined, and a long shadow began to stretch across continents. The story of World War II had begun. After the invasion of Poland, the war began to spread quietly but swiftly across Europe. Germany, with its new tactics known as blitzkrieg, moved like a shadow over the continent. Armies were fast, planes roared above, and the ground shook under the march of tanks. Cities, towns, and forests became stages for both fear and resilience. In the autumn of 1939, France and Britain mobilized their forces, but the initial months were calm along the Western Front. This period became known as the Phony War, a time when nations prepared quietly, fortified borders, and studied the movements of their enemies. People in villages and cities tried to maintain normal lives, though tension lingered in every corner,
like a soft hum in the air. Then, in 1940, the quiet ended. Germany launched attacks across Denmark, Norway, and the Low Countries. France, despite its preparations, faced a rapid and devastating advance. Paris fell, and millions witnessed the swift change in control. Evacuations, like the famous retreat from Dunkirk, were both frightening and miraculous. Soldiers and civilians alike navigated rivers, beaches, and roads, carrying hope alongside fear. Across the English Channel, Britain prepared for a possible invasion. The skies became a battleground in what would be remembered as the Battle of Britain. Pilots soared above the clouds, their planes slicing through the blue, defending homes and skies. The world watched as courage and strategy intertwined in moments both tense and awe-inspiring. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union quietly observed, planning and adjusting. Alliances shifted, treaties were signed, and every decision seemed to ripple like waves through a stormy sea. Across oceans, Japan advanced in Asia, capturing lands and stretching supply lines, showing the conflict was becoming truly global. By the end of this period, Europe was transformed. Borders were uncertain, cities changed hands, and the rhythm of life adjusted to the patterns of war. Every action, every movement, and every choice shaped the path ahead, slowly guiding the world toward years of struggle, resilience, and unforgettable moments that would decide the fate of nations.
As 1940 moved on, the conflict quietly spread to the sunlit shores and deserts of the Mediterranean. Italy, under Mussolini, sought to expand its influence. Italian forces crossed into North Africa, aiming to control the deserts and seas. But the desert was vast, silent, and unforgiving. Armies moved slowly across sands that shifted like water, while the sun cast long golden shadows over the dunes. In North Africa, the British forces responded, maneuvering across wide expanses. Tanks and troops moved with careful precision, using knowledge of the land to their advantage. Battles were not just fought with guns and planes, but with strategy, patience, and endurance. Supply lines stretched long across the desert, and every oasis, every hill, and every stretch of road became vital to survival. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean Sea, naval forces quietly engaged in contests of control. Convoys moved like careful threads, carrying supplies, men, and equipment. Submarines lurked in deep waters, and ships moved with stealth and caution. The fight for control of the seas was just as decisive as the battles on land, shaping the ability of nations to sustain their efforts. Across the region, civilians lived in quiet tension. Life continued even amid fear. As markets opened, children played cautiously, and communities adjusted to the ebb and flow of war. Cities along the coasts and in valleys became temporary homes for soldiers, refugees, and those seeking safety. Their stories, often untold, threaded through the larger tapestry of global conflict. By the end of this period, the war had reached new landscapes. From the quiet forests of Europe to the deserts of North Africa, the conflict was growing, touching every horizon and drawing nations into a rhythm of movement, preparation, and quiet determination.
As the war moved into 1941, the oceans became vast, quiet theaters of tension and strategy. The Battle of the Atlantic Ocean stretched across miles of deep, rolling water, where ships traveled like cautious whispers through the waves. Submarines and warships moved in a delicate dance, each side attempting to control vital supply routes. Convoys of merchant ships carrying food, weapons, and supplies sailed under the watchful eyes of escort vessels, ever alert to unseen dangers lurking beneath the surface. Storms rolled across the North Atlantic, and nights were long and silent, except for the distant echoes of engines or the soft murmur of waves against hulls. Sailors moved with care, often working in near darkness, their lives dependent on vigilance, endurance, and the careful coordination of fleets. Every decision by commanders, every adjustment to a convoy's course had consequences that could ripple for hundreds of miles, affecting both soldiers and civilians far from the sea. Meanwhile, across continents, the war quietly intensified. In Europe, Germany continued its expansion eastward, and the Soviet Union began preparing for the challenges ahead. Borders shifted, armies gathered, and intelligence moved like hidden currents through nations. Leaders studied reports, maps, and radio messages, making decisions that would not only decide the movements of troops, but the fates of countless lives. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan's ambitions grew. Quietly and methodically, they moved to secure territories and resources, creating a tension that would soon draw even more nations into the conflict. Cities, islands, and remote outposts were carefully fortified, while diplomatic exchanges attempted to slow the inevitable. Across oceans, governments and military leaders weighed strategies, supplies, and alliances, knowing that the scale of this war would soon encompass nearly every corner of the globe. Amid these vast movements, civilians everywhere adjusted to the rhythm of war. Families rationed food, rebuilt communities, and moved with quiet caution through towns and cities affected by occupation, bombings, or military presence. Children learned new patterns of daily life, and adults carried the weight of uncertainty with quiet resilience. Every human story, no matter how small, became part of the larger unfolding tapestry of global conflict. By the end of this period, the world felt the expanding reach of war. Oceans, deserts, forests, and cities were all caught in the quiet, relentless motion of armies, navies, and air forces. The battle lines, though sometimes invisible, stretched far and wide. And within each decision, each quiet night, and each careful advance, the future of nations was slowly being shaped.
In the early summer of 1941, the war shifted dramatically as Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest land invasion in history, stretching across vast plains, dense forests, and frozen rivers. Early morning skies were filled with the quiet hum of aircraft, while armored divisions moved steadily across roads and fields, leaving a trail of anticipation, tension, and uncertainty. The scale of the campaign was immense. Millions of soldiers advanced in coordinated movements, yet the terrain itself became an additional challenge. Thick forests slowed progress, rivers needed careful crossings, and supply lines stretched further with every mile gained. Commanders on both sides had to think not only about strategy, but also about logistics, weather, and the endurance of the men and machines under their command. The Soviet forces responded with fierce resistance. Cities, towns, and small villages became focal points of conflict. Each encounter, whether in open fields or narrow streets, shaped the larger rhythm of the front.
Civilians, often caught between advancing and retreating armies, navigated danger with quiet determination, finding shelter in homes, basements, and forests. The human cost, though unseen from command centers, was always present in every careful movement and decision. As summer turned to autumn, the vastness of the Soviet Union began to challenge the German advance. Long roads became muddy quagmires, rivers swelled with rain, and the cold winds whispered warnings of the coming winter. Military planners had predicted rapid victories, but the land itself seemed determined to slow progress, and resistance grew stronger with each passing day. Amid these sweeping movements, the scale of the conflict became more apparent to the world. Every battle, every retreat, and every strategic decision carried consequences that stretched far beyond the immediate front. Leaders weighed options quietly, understanding that mistakes could be catastrophic, while soldiers moved forward with resilience, endurance, and a growing awareness of the immense challenge before them. By the end of this period, the Eastern Front had become a theater of vast, quiet struggles, where patience, determination, and human endurance were tested continuously. The war was no longer just a series of territorial gains or losses. It was a contest of will, strategy, and the ability to persist against enormous odds. Across forests, rivers, and plains, the echo of this struggle would shape the outcome of battles yet to come, influencing the course of history in ways that were only beginning to be understood.
In December of 1941, the war quietly erupted across the Pacific, drawing the United States into the global conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor came early in the morning, under skies painted with gentle hues of dawn. Warplanes moved swiftly, their engines a distant roar over the calm harbor waters. Ships, docked in quiet anticipation of a peaceful day, suddenly became part of a battle that would ripple across oceans and continents. The surprise was profound. Explosions sent plumes of smoke curling into the air, and sailors and civilians alike were thrown into chaos, finding themselves in a sudden struggle for survival. Fires burned against the morning light, while the water shimmered with reflections of both destruction and resilience. Within hours, news spread, and the world watched as a quiet, distant conflict became unmistakably global. Across the Pacific, Japan moved with swift precision, aiming to secure islands, ports, and resources to strengthen its position. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and amphibious forces orchestrated landings on far-flung islands, turning beaches, jungles, and harbors into theaters of both strategy and endurance. The movement of troops and equipment across these vast distances required careful planning, patience, and an understanding of the sea and skies that only time and experience could bring. Meanwhile, the United States began mobilizing. Factories, ports, and airfields transformed in a continuous, quiet rhythm of preparation. Soldiers trained, sailors studied maps and charts, and engineers devised new ways to move equipment efficiently across oceans. Though the scale of the task was immense, a steady determination spread through the nation, bringing focus, resolve, and an unspoken awareness that the coming years would demand extraordinary effort. The Pacific Islands themselves became landscapes of quiet tension. Dense jungles, rocky cliffs, and sandy beaches offered both challenges and opportunities for defenders and attackers alike. Each operation, whether a landing, a reconnaissance mission, or a naval engagement, required patience and careful attention to detail. Even in moments of calm, the threat of sudden action was ever present,
shaping the rhythm of life for all involved. By the end of this period, the United States was fully engaged in the global conflict. Oceans, skies, and islands now formed an interconnected network of strategy, endurance, and quiet courage. Every decision, every movement, and every careful advance contributed to a larger story, one that would continue to unfold across continents and oceans, shaping the course of history in subtle but profound ways.
Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific became a vast stage of movement, tension, and strategic encounters. Japanese forces advanced across islands, ports, and territories with quiet efficiency, capturing places like the Philippines, Malaya, and other key locations. Each landing was a careful orchestration of soldiers, ships, and aircraft, moving in harmony with the rhythm of the ocean and the winds above. In the Philippines, soldiers and civilians faced difficult choices. Islands became battlegrounds where jungle paths, rivers, and coastlines were transformed into zones of both danger and survival. Quiet forests hid watchful eyes and hidden troops. Every movement, from a careful march along a trail to the steady rotation of artillery, shaped the unfolding course of the conflict. Civilians adapted to new routines, moving quietly through towns, finding shelter in basements, and assisting in ways that often went unnoticed but were vital to endurance. Farther west, in Malaya, the Japanese advance relied on speed and precision. Roads twisted through dense vegetation, and small towns and plantations became strategic points. Resistance forces moved with caution, aware that each decision could determine the safety of hundreds or even thousands. Air attacks, artillery strikes, and tactical retreats played out with measured intensity, a quiet reminder of the scale and reach of the war. Amid these advances, the Allied forces began to coordinate responses across the Pacific. Naval fleets maneuvered with careful precision. Carriers and battleships patrolled distant waters, and reconnaissance aircraft moved like silent observers, gathering information to guide future decisions. Every message transmitted over radio waves, every map studied under lamplight, contributed to a larger pattern of strategy and anticipation. The turning point of this early period came quietly, yet decisively, at the Battle of Midway. Naval forces from both sides moved with precision across open ocean. Aircraft lifted into the skies, diving and climbing in patterns that combined courage, timing, and careful calculation. The outcome shifted momentum subtly but significantly, demonstrating that strategy, patience, and attention to detail could influence the trajectory of the war across thousands of miles of water. By the end of this period, the Pacific had become a theater of endurance, movement, and calculated effort. From dense jungles to wide open seas, every soldier, sailor, and civilian contributed to a complex, interconnected story. Quiet moments between battles, nights under stars, and careful planning all played roles in shaping the larger rhythm of the war, preparing the world for the pivotal years to come.
As 1941 drew to a close, the Eastern Front settled into a long, quiet struggle against the bitter winter. The advance of German forces into the Soviet Union had slowed, as the vastness of the land and the harshness of the cold began to assert themselves. Snow-blanketed forests, rivers froze over, and wind swept across plains,
carrying with it both danger and quiet endurance. In cities like Leningrad, the population endured a siege that tested patience, resourcefulness, and resilience. Streets were empty except for those carrying out essential tasks, and the daily rhythm of life adjusted to rationing, harsh weather, and the constant presence of uncertainty. Even in the midst of deprivation, people found ways to persevere, to maintain small routines, and to hold on to hope, creating a quiet heartbeat amid the larger storm of war. Meanwhile, Soviet forces regrouped, trained, and quietly reinforced positions across the front. Armies moved cautiously through snow-covered forests, using knowledge of the terrain and winter conditions to their advantage. The German advance, which had once seemed unstoppable, now faced relentless resistance. Skirmishes along frozen rivers, ambushes in wooded areas, and defensive fortifications became a rhythm of quiet, continuous struggle. Supply lines became a central concern. Both sides faced enormous challenges in transporting food, ammunition, and equipment over long distances, often through snow, ice, and treacherous roads. Decisions about where to advance, retreat, or reinforce positions required careful calculation, patience, and an understanding that a single misstep could have lasting consequences. As winter wore on, the resilience of the Soviet people and the determination of their soldiers began to slow the invaders. Cities, towns, and forests became stages for both endurance and courage. Every quiet night, every cautious advance, and every small victory, whether reclaiming a village or maintaining a defensive line, contributed to the larger, slow-moving momentum that would shape the coming battles. By the end of this period, the Eastern Front had transformed into a vast arena of patience, strategy, and human endurance. The war was no longer simply about rapid advances or dramatic victories. It was about persistence, adaptation, and the steady, quiet determination to endure. Across snow-covered plains, frozen rivers, and besieged cities, the story of resistance, survival, and strategy continued to unfold, shaping the course of history in subtle yet profound ways.
By 1942, the war had reached a moment of quiet but profound change. Across multiple continents, battles raged, strategies evolved, and the momentum of conflict began to shift in subtle but decisive ways. The Eastern Front remained vast, cold, and challenging, while North Africa and other theaters became central to the unfolding global struggle. In the East, the city of Stalingrad became the focus of a slow, grueling struggle. Buildings, streets, and factories turned into stages for prolonged combat, each block contested with careful strategy, patience, and determination. Soldiers moved quietly through ruins, aware that every choice, every step, could influence the outcome of months of effort. The harsh winter added an extra layer of endurance as both attackers and defenders navigated snow, ice, and biting wind. Civilians trapped within the city adapted to rationing and uncertainty, holding on to hope amid the chaos. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein unfolded along desert sands and sun-baked plains. Armies advanced cautiously across dunes, their movements measured and deliberate. Tanks rolled steadily, artillery fired with calculated precision, and soldiers adjusted to the heat of the day and the cold of the desert night. Each engagement, though tense, was part of a larger rhythm of strategy and endurance,
where careful planning and patience often determined outcomes more than sudden force. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, naval and air forces continued to maneuver with quiet skill. Supply routes, convoy protection, and strategic positioning shaped the global scope of the war. Every decision made in distant command centers, whether plotting the movements of fleets or coordinating aircraft, rippled across continents, influencing battles in ways both subtle and profound. By late 1942 and early 1943, the tide began to turn. At Stalingrad, the resilience and strategy of Soviet forces began to halt the German advance, marking the start of a slow pushback across the eastern plains. In North Africa, the Allied victory at El Alamein disrupted Axis momentum, giving hope and direction to global operations. These moments, though often quiet in the midst of daily struggle, became milestones that shifted the rhythm of the war and influenced decisions in command rooms far from the front lines. Through every skirmish, advance, and retreat, the human element remained central. Soldiers endured exhaustion, cold, hunger, and uncertainty, while civilians adjusted routines, sought safety, and carried on with quiet perseverance. Across cities, deserts, and forests, the war's course was shaped not only by strategy and firepower, but also by resilience and endurance, and the careful attention to detail in every movement, every choice, and every night spent under the uncertain sky. By the end of this period, the global conflict had entered a new phase, one where hope, determination, and strategic patience began to guide the actions of nations, quietly yet decisively steering the course of history toward pivotal turning points.
By 1943, the war had shifted its focus once more, as Allied forces turned their attention to the Italian peninsula. The campaign began with careful planning, as amphibious landings, airborne operations, and naval movements converged to create a complex rhythm of strategy and endurance. Islands like Sicily became the first stage, where soldiers moved cautiously across beaches, hills, and small towns, each step measured and deliberate. The landscape itself became both a challenge and an ally. Mountains rose sharply above valleys, rivers cut quietly through the terrain, and dense forests offered cover and concealment. Soldiers advanced with patience, navigating these natural obstacles while maintaining supply lines, communication, and coordination. Every careful movement, every reconnaissance mission, and every quiet night spent under the stars contributed to a slow but steady progression toward objectives. In Sicily, towns and villages became temporary theaters of strategy and adaptation. Civilians, often displaced or uncertain of the outcome, moved quietly through familiar streets, finding shelter wherever possible. Soldiers and local populations learned to coexist in these spaces of tension, adjusting to the rhythm of war with endurance and careful attention to surroundings. The capture of key ports, airfields, and roadways provided momentum for the continued advance into mainland Italy, where each mountain pass and valley demanded thoughtful planning. The Italian mainland, with its long coastlines and rugged interior, required even greater attention to detail. Operations moved methodically, balancing offense and defense. Tanks, artillery, and infantry worked in unison, each supporting the other. Aircraft patrolled skies, observing both enemy movements and terrain patterns, ensuring that each maneuver could be executed safely and effectively. Even quiet nights were filled with preparation, as commanders considered supply routes, troop rotations, and the timing of each advance.
Through this campaign, the human element remained central. Soldiers endured long marches, challenging weather, and relentless pressure, while engineers, medics, and support personnel quietly ensured the continuity of operations. Civilians adapted, sometimes assisting, sometimes retreating, but always contributing to the subtle, interconnected rhythm of life during wartime. By the end of this period, the Italian campaign had demonstrated that victory often came through patience, endurance, and strategic attention to detail. Mountains were crossed, towns were liberated, and momentum shifted gradually across the peninsula. Every quiet step, every careful decision, and every night under the uncertain sky contributed to the slow but steady movement of history, shaping the next phase of the conflict and the broader story of World War II.
By 1943, the momentum on the Eastern Front had begun to shift. After the grueling struggle at Stalingrad, the Soviet forces slowly and methodically began a counteroffensive that would stretch across plains, rivers, and forests. The vastness of the land made every advance a test of patience, endurance, and careful planning. Soldiers moved with caution, knowing that success required both strategy and the ability to endure the elements, the terrain, and the pressures of relentless conflict. The city of Kursk became the site of one of the largest armored battles in history. Tanks, artillery, and infantry advanced and retreated in careful coordination. The sounds of engines, the distant rumble of artillery, and the quiet rustle of forests under pressure formed a rhythm that seemed almost continuous, a persistent hum beneath the surface of the larger war. Every maneuver was measured, every decision weighed with the understanding that small adjustments could have enormous consequences. Throughout these campaigns, supply lines remained essential. Roads, railways, and rivers became vital arteries, carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Harsh weather often slowed progress, with muddy roads in spring, scorching heat in summer, and bitter cold in winter testing the endurance of both men and machines. Commanders had to anticipate these challenges, balancing rapid movements with the necessity of maintaining strength and cohesion across vast distances. Meanwhile, civilians on the Eastern Front endured quietly but resiliently. Villages, towns, and cities scarred by occupation and bombardment became part of a delicate tapestry of survival. Families rationed food, sought shelter, and found small ways to preserve routines amid the uncertainty. Each day carried the quiet weight of endurance, the soft rhythm of life pressed against the backdrop of global conflict.
By 1944, the Italian campaign had progressed steadily. A slow and deliberate push through mountains, valleys, and coastal plains. Allied forces moved with patience, coordinating landings, advances, and logistical support. Each step was carefully measured, as commanders balanced the need for momentum with the challenge of difficult terrain and well-fortified enemy positions. Hills, rivers, and forests became both obstacles and guides, shaping the rhythm of each operation with quiet significance. In towns and villages along the way, civilians adjusted to the constant movement of armies. Markets and streets carried a different rhythm. People moved cautiously, rebuilding where they could, sharing resources quietly, and maintaining routines that provided small comforts amid uncertainty. Soldiers, engineers, and medics worked in concert, their coordinated efforts ensuring that each advance was sustainable and each position secured, creating a continuous pattern of strategy and endurance. While the Italian front demanded patience and determination, planners in Britain, the United States, and Canada quietly prepared for a massive operation that would reshape the war: the invasion of Normandy. Months of preparation went into assembling troops, ships, landing craft, and supplies, each detail considered under lamplight or in quiet meetings. Maps were studied, beaches were observed, and contingencies for every possible scenario were planned. Even in the calm before the storm, the tension was palpable, a quiet undercurrent guiding every decision. Across the English Channel, soldiers trained and rehearsed landings on beaches that would soon become the front lines. Night exercises, small-scale drills, and detailed briefings shaped a rhythm of readiness that required endurance, focus, and careful attention to detail. Engineers and logisticians worked tirelessly, ensuring that vehicles, equipment, and supplies would arrive where needed at precisely the right moment. Each person, from the highest-ranking commander to the newest recruit, contributed to a delicate, interconnected orchestration that would determine the success of the operation. Meanwhile, in the Pacific and on the Eastern Front, other battles continued quietly, but with equal importance. Supply lines, reinforcements, and local engagements ensured that every theater of war was active, influencing broader strategies and decisions. The rhythm of global conflict created a continuous web of preparation, adaptation, and resilience, where each small movement affected the larger story in ways both subtle and profound. By the end of this period, the Allied forces were poised for a historic advance. Italy's mountains and valleys had been navigated, enemy positions contested, and preparations for Normandy nearly complete. The quiet determination of countless individuals, soldiers, civilians, planners, and medics alike, had set the stage for one of the most decisive chapters of the war. Every careful step, every night under the uncertain sky, and every thoughtful decision contributed to the slow, steady shaping of history as the world moved closer to the climactic events of 1944.
On the morning of June 6, 1944, the world held its breath as Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. Before the first light of dawn, the English Channel was dotted with ships carrying troops, tanks, and supplies. The gentle swell of the water contrasted with the tension in the air as thousands of soldiers prepared to step onto the beaches of Normandy, each aware of the importance of the moment and the dangers that lay ahead. Paratroopers had already begun their silent descent, floating gently from the skies into fields, woods, and villages behind enemy lines. Their movements were deliberate, precise, and crucial, designed to secure key roads and bridges, to create openings for the larger invasion forces. Below, the beaches awaited, long stretches of sand framed by cliffs, obstacles, and defensive fortifications. The world seemed to pause as waves lapped quietly against the shore, hiding the intensity that was about to erupt. When the first waves of soldiers landed, the quiet morning was pierced by the sounds of battle.
tanks advanced across sand, soldiers navigated obstacles, and artillery fire rolled in distant echoes, blending with the natural rhythm of waves and wind. Each movement was careful and measured as commanders coordinated attacks, reinforcements, and support from naval and air forces. Progress was slow but steady, every yard gained marking both courage and strategy in a complex orchestration of human effort. Civilians in nearby towns and villages watched quietly from the edges of streets and fields, adjusting to the rhythm of conflict and the movement of armies. They became witnesses to history in small, intimate ways, offering aid, seeking shelter, or simply observing the vast movement of soldiers and vehicles across their familiar landscapes. Every detail, from the placement of artillery to the careful coordination of supply routes, played a role in the unfolding operation, demonstrating the importance of preparation, patience, and strategic timing. As the day turned into evening, the Allies began to secure key positions inland. Roads, fields, and small towns were gradually brought under control, each gained through careful coordination, endurance, and determination. The initial shock of the landing gave way to a steady rhythm of consolidation, planning, and preparation for the continued push into occupied France. Every movement, every supply convoy, and every cautious advance contributed to the momentum that would carry the Allies further toward victory. By the end of this day, the Normandy beaches were firmly in Allied hands. The quiet patience, careful planning, and courage of thousands had combined to create a foothold that would be the launching point for further operations across France. Night fell gently over the countryside, and soldiers rested where they could, aware that tomorrow would bring new challenges. In these calm moments, history itself seemed to pause, reflecting the quiet endurance and careful determination that had made D-Day possible.
Following the successful landings at Normandy, Allied forces faced the next phase of a slow but determined advance across France. The beaches had been secured, but beyond them lay hedgerows, fields, rivers, and towns that required careful navigation. Every movement was deliberate, guided by both strategy and the natural rhythms of the landscape, as soldiers advanced cautiously, aware of the complexity of the task before them. The hedgerows of Normandy became quiet yet formidable obstacles. Thick green barriers stretched across fields, hiding trenches, machine guns, and defensive positions. Soldiers moved carefully, learning to navigate these natural fortifications while maintaining cohesion and communication. Tanks and artillery supported the infantry, advancing with measured patience, while engineers cleared paths and bridges to maintain the steady flow of supply and reinforcements. Villages along the way became temporary stages for both resistance and liberation. Civilians emerged cautiously from basements and side streets, witnessing the slow but inevitable shift of control. Quiet routines adapted to the rhythm of military movement. Markets reopened cautiously, small farms resumed their work, and communities offered assistance to advancing forces whenever possible. The resilience of local populations became an understated yet essential part of the campaign, blending seamlessly with the strategic operations of soldiers and commanders. The breakout from Normandy required coordination across vast areas. Roads, rivers, and railway lines became critical arteries, ensuring that men, equipment, and supplies moved efficiently. Commanders at all levels studied maps,
weather patterns, and enemy movements to anticipate challenges, ensuring that every action was deliberate and calculated. Even in moments of apparent calm, the rhythm of preparation, movement, and endurance continued steadily in the background. By late summer of 1944, the Allied forces had pushed deeper into France. Towns were liberated one by one, bridges were secured, and supply lines stretched forward like quiet lifelines. The liberation of Paris, a city marked by both history and occupation, symbolized a turning point. Celebrations were subdued, mindful of the ongoing conflict, but the joy and relief of the citizens reflected the cumulative impact of months of careful planning, patience, and endurance. Across fields, rivers, and towns, the war continued, shaped by strategy, resilience, and the steady, patient determination of those involved.
By the autumn of 1944, Allied forces had advanced beyond France and approached the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands. The landscape shifted, becoming a mix of rolling hills, narrow river valleys, and dense forests, each shaping the rhythm of the campaign. Soldiers moved carefully, balancing the urgency of advancing with the need for strategic patience, knowing that each step could influence the course of the winter months ahead. The liberation of Belgium and the Netherlands required methodical planning. Towns, villages, and waterways became vital points of control, where every bridge, road, and canal influenced the movement of troops and supplies. Engineers worked quietly to repair infrastructure damaged by retreating forces, ensuring that the flow of reinforcements and provisions could continue steadily. Soldiers advanced with caution, aware of both enemy resistance and the delicate task of minimizing civilian suffering in the midst of operations. As winter approached, the quiet tension of preparation gave way to sudden bursts of action. In December 1944, the Germans launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest, an event that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Dense forests, rolling hills, and snow-covered terrain shaped the movements of both attackers and defenders. Soldiers navigated icy roads and limited visibility, each decision influenced by careful observation, endurance, and strategic foresight. The initial German advance created pockets of intense engagement, where coordination, patience, and resilience determined outcomes. Tanks moved slowly through snow, infantry advanced cautiously, and artillery positions were carefully adjusted to respond to shifting circumstances. Despite the harsh weather and sudden pressure, Allied forces responded with determination, reorganizing supply lines, reinforcing positions, and carefully coordinating counterattacks to contain the bulge in the front line. Civilians in the affected regions experienced a quiet tension unlike anything seen before. Families moved cautiously through towns and villages, finding shelter and ensuring the safety of children and the elderly. Markets and local routines adjusted to the movement of armies, and quiet acts of endurance, sharing food, tending to the wounded, and maintaining homes continued alongside the larger rhythm of military operations. By the end of this period, the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the Allied forces. Momentum, though temporarily challenged, had shifted steadily in their favor. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike had contributed to the delicate, persistent orchestration of strategy, patience, and endurance that characterized this stage of the war. Across forests, rivers, and villages, the quiet rhythm of preparation, advance, and survival continued, shaping the path toward the final months of the European conflict. By early 1945, Allied forces had crossed into Germany, moving steadily through towns, rivers, and forests toward the heart of the nation. The Rhine River, broad and imposing, became both a natural barrier and a critical milestone. Engineers and soldiers worked in quiet coordination to build bridges, repair roads, and maintain the flow of reinforcements and supplies. Every movement required patience, precision, and awareness of both the terrain and enemy positions. Towns along the way had been scarred by retreating forces and previous battles. Civilians cautiously emerged from shelters, basements, and temporary homes, adjusting to the rhythm of advancing armies. Markets reopened slowly, and small communities contributed in subtle ways, offering guidance, tending to the wounded, and helping maintain the continuity of supply and communication. Every quiet act added to the larger momentum of the campaign, supporting the delicate orchestration of strategy and endurance. The push across the Rhine marked a turning point. Soldiers crossed the river under careful planning, coordinating artillery, infantry, and armored divisions. Aircraft patrolled the skies, observing both enemy movements and terrain patterns, ensuring that every advance could proceed with minimal disruption. While the pace was deliberate, each step brought the Allies closer to the heart of Germany, reinforcing the cumulative effect of months of careful preparation and persistent effort. As forces advanced, German resistance became increasingly fragmented. Cities, villages, and defensive positions were engaged in methodical operations, where patience, coordination, and endurance were essential. Tanks and artillery supported infantry in slow but steady movements, while reconnaissance units observed and reported back, guiding commanders in decisions that balanced aggression with careful calculation. Even in moments of apparent calm, the rhythm of planning, supply, and cautious advancement continued unbroken. The approach to Berlin marked the culmination of years of strategy, perseverance, and endurance. Each mile gained was a testament to careful coordination and human determination. Soldiers prepared for the final operations, securing key positions and ensuring that supply lines remained intact. Civilians, aware of the impending conclusion of hostilities, adjusted to the quiet anticipation that hung over towns and villages. Every night under the stars, every quiet march through forests and fields, and every careful advance of armor and infantry contributed to a collective momentum that had been years in the making. By the end of this period, the Allies stood on the threshold of Berlin. The Rhine had been crossed, German defenses had been gradually overcome, and the cumulative effects of strategy, endurance, and coordinated effort had brought the conflict to its final phase. Across rivers, forests, and towns, the rhythm of advance, preparation, and quiet determination set the stage for the closing chapter of the European War, shaping the outcome of history in ways both profound and enduring.
By the spring of 1945, Allied and Soviet forces converged on Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. The city, once bustling with life, now bore the quiet scars of years of conflict. Streets, buildings, and squares had become stages for both destruction and endurance.
Soldiers advanced carefully through urban terrain, mindful of the challenges of close-quarter combat and the presence of civilians who remained in the city. The Soviet advance approached from the east, while Western Allied forces pressed from the west. Artillery, tanks, and infantry coordinated in a rhythm of slow, deliberate movement, balancing aggression with caution. Streets became corridors of strategy, where each building, intersection, and bridge held tactical importance. Commanders planned each step with attention to detail, ensuring that soldiers could advance safely while maintaining momentum toward the ultimate objective. Inside Berlin, Hitler faced the collapse of the empire he had built. In quiet, tense rooms underground, he and his closest advisors made decisions that could no longer influence the broader tide of the war. The city itself became both a stage and a symbol as the once powerful regime confronted its inevitable end. Meanwhile, civilians navigated the daily reality of the siege, seeking safety, securing food, and witnessing history unfold in the streets around them. The fighting within Berlin was methodical and unrelenting. Soldiers moved building by building, street by street, carefully advancing while minimizing unnecessary risk. Tanks provided support, and artillery targeted strategic positions with precision. Even in moments of quiet between engagements, the city itself seemed alive with tension. Each sound of movement or distant explosion a reminder of the fragile balance between advance and resistance. As April turned to May, the final days approached. Hitler's death marked the symbolic and practical end of Nazi leadership. German forces, exhausted and surrounded, began to surrender in increasing numbers. Civilians cautiously emerged from shelters, stepping into streets that were slowly being secured by the advancing armies. Across Berlin, the rhythm of combat gradually shifted to one of consolidation, care, and rebuilding, as the city and its people prepared to transition from conflict to peace. By the beginning of May 1945, Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe, after 6 years of immense struggle, had reached its conclusion. Soldiers and civilians alike paused, reflecting quietly on the endurance, strategy, and resilience that had shaped the final months. The streets, forests, and towns bore witness to the cumulative effects of years of careful planning, patient advancement, and human determination. Across the continent, the echoes of war slowly faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of reconstruction, remembrance, and the cautious hope of a new beginning.
While Europe celebrated the end of the war, the Pacific theater remained a vast and challenging stage. By early 1945, Allied forces were steadily advancing toward Japan, capturing islands that had been under Japanese control for years. Each island presented a unique landscape: volcanic slopes, dense jungles, rocky beaches, and coral reefs, demanding careful planning, endurance, and precision from soldiers, sailors, and airmen alike. The battle for Iwo Jima became a quiet yet intense test of strategy and resilience. Soldiers landed on volcanic sands, advancing slowly against entrenched defenders. The terrain itself was unforgiving. Black sand stretched beneath the morning sun. Cliffs and ridges provided cover for opposing forces, and tunnels and fortifications concealed unexpected challenges.
Despite the chaos, each movement was deliberate, every step measured as troops navigated obstacles, provided cover for one another, and secured positions to allow reinforcements to arrive safely. Okinawa, larger and even more complex, became a prolonged engagement. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen coordinated in careful operations, advancing across hills, fields, and urban areas. The island's natural features shaped every action. Steep cliffs slowed progress, forests hid defensive positions, and beaches required precise timing for landings. Supply lines, medical support, and communication networks had to function flawlessly to sustain momentum. Even in moments of relative calm, the rhythm of preparation, observation, and careful movement continued, underscoring the patience and endurance required to succeed. Across the Pacific, air and naval operations provided crucial support. Aircraft carried out reconnaissance, strikes, and transport missions, while naval forces maintained supply lines and provided artillery support for advancing troops. Every coordinated effort required careful timing and attention to detail, ensuring that progress was steady, even amid challenges posed by weather, terrain, and enemy defenses. Meanwhile, civilians on the islands adapted to the rhythm of conflict. Villages, towns, and coastal communities were disrupted, yet daily life, quiet routines, small acts of survival, and the cautious navigation of war zones continued alongside military operations. Their resilience, often unseen, contributed to the overall rhythm of the campaign, providing both logistical support and a reminder of the human dimension of war. By the end of this period, Allied forces had established critical footholds on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, positioning themselves for the final approach to Japan. The campaign demonstrated the necessity of patience, endurance, and strategic coordination on a vast scale. Across volcanic slopes, dense jungles, and sandy beaches, the careful orchestration of movement, logistics, and human determination continued to shape the final chapter of the Pacific War, setting the stage for the conclusion of a global conflict that had spanned continents, oceans, and years of relentless struggle.
By mid-1945, the Pacific War had brought Allied forces to the doorstep of Japan. Months of island-hopping campaigns had positioned troops, ships, and aircraft for a decisive conclusion. But the cost of a full-scale invasion loomed heavily in the minds of planners. Every step of preparation reflected careful consideration of lives, logistics, and the far-reaching consequences of strategy. In August, a new and unprecedented decision was made. The United States deployed atomic bombs, the technology both powerful and terrifying. Hiroshima, a city of quiet streets and daily routines, became the first target. Early in the morning, the sky was calm, the sun rising over rooftops and riverbanks. Then came a sudden brilliant flash of light, followed by an immense force that reshaped the landscape. The city, its buildings, and its people experienced an impact that was immediate and profound, leaving echoes that would ripple through history. 3 days later, the city of Nagasaki faced a similar fate. Again, a calm morning gave way to a transformative explosion, altering the course of the war and the future of humanity. Soldiers, civilians, and planners alike grappled with the enormity of the events, understanding both the strategic purpose and the human consequences. Across Japan, these bombings created a moment of quiet reckoning, a pause
that emphasized the urgency of surrender and the desire to prevent further devastation. In response, Japan moved towards surrender. Officials communicated carefully, negotiating terms that would bring hostilities to an end while preserving essential aspects of national governance. Civilians, many having endured years of hardship, emerged cautiously from shelters, streets, and homes, witnessing the beginning of transition from war to peace. The quiet rhythm of daily life slowly resumed, even amid the vast scale of destruction, as communities began the painstaking work of recovery. Allied forces coordinated the formal surrender, ensuring that occupation, administration, and the preservation of order were conducted carefully. Soldiers and officers moved into cities and regions with measured precision, balancing authority with patience and enabling the slow, steady process of stabilization. Every step of the surrender reflected lessons learned over years of global conflict, emphasizing planning, endurance, and the human capacity for recovery and reconciliation. By mid-August 1945, Japan formally surrendered, marking the end of World War II. Across continents, oceans, and islands, the war's quiet conclusion was felt in countless ways. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders paused to reflect on years of endurance, strategy, and human determination. Cities, forests, deserts, and oceans bore witness to the complex rhythm of conflict and resolution. Every careful decision, every patient advance, and every quiet act of courage contributed to the ultimate outcome, shaping the post-war world and the trajectory of history for generations to come.
With the surrender of Germany and Japan, the world entered a period of reflection, reconstruction, and reckoning. Cities lay in ruins, factories had been destroyed, and millions of lives had been altered by years of relentless conflict. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, people began the slow process of rebuilding homes, communities, and nations. Streets that once echoed with the sounds of battle gradually filled with quiet footsteps of civilians returning to routines, repairing buildings, and reclaiming a sense of normalcy. The Nuremberg trials became a cornerstone of accountability. Leaders responsible for war crimes were brought before tribunals, examined under the scrutiny of law and human conscience. Courtrooms were quiet but intense, filled with testimony, evidence, and careful deliberation. These proceedings were not just about punishment, but about establishing a standard for justice, demonstrating that even in the aftermath of vast destruction, principles of fairness, responsibility, and humanity endured. Across continents, nations faced the immense task of reconstruction. Railways, ports, and roads were repaired to reconnect regions disrupted by war. Factories resumed production, often adapting to peacetime needs, while governments implemented programs to restore infrastructure, education, and social services. Civilians returned to schools, workplaces, and farms, gradually restoring the rhythm of daily life that had been interrupted for so many years. Patience, coordination, and resilience defined this period, as communities rebuilt not just structures, but the foundations of trust, cooperation, and hope. The human cost of the war lingered in quiet, enduring ways. Families mourned lost members, soldiers adapted to life after service, and societies confronted the long-term effects of trauma, displacement, and loss. Yet, alongside grief, there were acts of quiet courage and resilience, people helping neighbors, communities preserving culture,
and nations forging alliances to prevent future conflict. Every small act contributed to the slow, steady healing of the global community. The legacy of World War II extended beyond Reconstruction. It reshaped borders, influenced political systems, and gave rise to international organizations designed to maintain peace and cooperation. Nations reflected on the lessons learned, the importance of diplomacy, the dangers of unchecked aggression, and the value of collective responsibility. Across oceans, forests, plains, and cities, the memory of conflict became intertwined with the ongoing effort to build a more secure, compassionate, and connected world. By the end of this period, the war's conclusion was no longer defined solely by battles or surrender documents. It was reflected in the quiet persistence of humanity, the patient reconstruction of communities, the careful pursuit of justice, and the enduring hope for peace. From cities and towns to oceans and plains, the rhythm of life returned gradually, shaped by the lessons, resilience, and determination of millions. The story of World War II, with all its strategy, courage, and endurance, became a foundation for a world learning to balance remembrance with the quiet, ongoing work of healing, rebuilding, and moving forward.
As 1945 gave way to 1946, the world entered a period of slow recovery and cautious reflection. Cities, towns, and villages bore the quiet scars of years of global conflict. Factories, railways, and ports were being rebuilt, often with patient care and painstaking attention to detail. People moved through streets with a renewed sense of purpose, each step reflecting endurance, resilience, and hope. The former Allied powers, while celebrating victory, began to negotiate new spheres of influence. Diplomats and leaders worked quietly to establish international frameworks, ensuring that disputes could be addressed peacefully and that the balance of power would prevent further widespread conflict. The creation of the United Nations exemplified this careful orchestration, a global commitment to dialogue, law, and cooperation, formed from the quiet determination of many nations seeking stability and security. Across Europe, displaced populations returned slowly to familiar towns or sought new homes. Refugees, soldiers, and civilians adjusted to the rhythm of post-war life, repairing homes, clearing debris, and reconnecting with communities. Families re-established routines that had been interrupted for years. Children returned to school, markets reopened, and neighbors rebuilt the subtle social structures that give life its steady rhythm. Meanwhile, tensions quietly began to emerge between former allies. Differences in ideology, priorities, and security concerns hinted at a new kind of struggle. The Soviet Union consolidated influence across Eastern Europe, while the United States and Western European nations worked to stabilize economies, create infrastructure, and support democratic institutions. These early post-war maneuvers were not loud battles, but careful positioning, shaping a global stage that would define the decades to come. Culturally and socially, the world sought healing through reflection, remembrance, and subtle innovation. Literature, art, and music expressed the quiet endurance and resilience of those who lived through the war. Monuments were erected, memorials maintained, and ceremonies held.
each a gentle acknowledgement of loss and survival, honoring both collective history and individual courage. By the end of this period, the world had entered a slow, deliberate rhythm of recovery. Though the echoes of war remained in cities, fields, and oceans, people adapted to new routines and slowly rebuilt their lives. The seeds of global cooperation, remembrance, and cautious vigilance had been planted, creating a foundation for both recovery and the subtle tensions that would shape the emerging Cold War. Across continents, the quiet persistence of humanity continued, guiding the slow, steady movement from destruction toward reconstruction, reflection, and cautious optimism.
By 1946-1947, Europe was slowly recovering from the immense devastation of World War II. Cities had been scarred by bombings, villages were in ruins, and fields that had once grown crops now bore the traces of battle. Across the continent, people moved carefully through landscapes marked by destruction, quietly clearing rubble, repairing homes, and restoring infrastructure with a patience born of necessity and endurance. The Marshall Plan became a vital framework for rebuilding. Through careful coordination, resources flowed to cities and towns in need. Factories were reopened, transportation networks repaired, and ports restored to ensure the smooth movement of goods and people. Economies began to revive, and markets gradually resumed their quiet rhythm, supporting the slow, steady pace of recovery. Communities learned to coordinate reconstruction, working together to restore not only physical structures, but the social and economic fabric that had been disrupted by years of conflict. Displaced populations continued to return to familiar regions or settle in new areas. Refugees, former prisoners, and families separated by war carefully navigated a complex web of opportunities and challenges. Camps and temporary shelters were gradually replaced by permanent homes, schools reopened, and daily routines slowly reestablished. Each act of rebuilding was a quiet assertion of resilience, patience, and the determination to reclaim normal life after years of uncertainty. At the same time, early tensions of the Cold War began to surface. The Soviet Union consolidated influence across Eastern Europe, creating a sphere of control that contrasted sharply with the democratic and economic reconstruction efforts supported by Western nations. Diplomats, leaders, and military planners worked behind the scenes, negotiating, observing, and subtly positioning forces in ways that would define global politics for decades. Though not overtly violent, these early maneuvers were strategic, deliberate, and full of calculated caution. Cultural and social recovery paralleled economic and political efforts. Schools reopened with the intention of educating a generation that had experienced both disruption and resilience. Literature, art, and public memory focused on remembrance, endurance, and hope. Communities commemorated those who had been lost while quietly celebrating the persistence of those who had survived. Museums, memorials, and local observances became gentle reminders of history, preserving lessons for the future in a calm, reflective rhythm. By the end of this period, Europe had established a steady pace of recovery. Factories hummed with quiet productivity, streets gradually returned to normal activity, and communities regained a sense of routine.
the delicate balance of post-war politics, economic aid, and cultural remembrance shaped a landscape in which both healing and vigilance coexisted. Across cities, fields, and villages, the quiet rhythm of rebuilding continued, reflecting the endurance, patience, and strategic foresight that would define the early years of the Cold War and the broader post-war era.
After Japan's surrender in 1945, the country entered a period of careful reconstruction under Allied supervision. Cities such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore the profound scars of atomic bombings, while other regions suffered from conventional destruction and years of wartime deprivation. Across Japan, people moved quietly through streets, homes, and markets, slowly reclaiming routines disrupted by conflict and rebuilding their lives with patience, resilience, and determination. The Allied occupation, led primarily by American forces, implemented a series of reforms aimed at transforming political, economic, and social structures. The Constitution was rewritten to ensure democratic governance, granting freedoms previously restricted and encouraging participation in a more equitable society. Schools reopened and educational reforms took hold, emphasizing both critical thinking and the peaceful responsibilities of citizenship. Civilians adapted gradually to these new systems, integrating the lessons of governance and civic responsibility into daily life. Economic recovery became a careful, methodical process. Factories were repaired, agricultural production restored, and trade networks gradually revived. Infrastructure projects, from roads and railways to ports and communication networks, were meticulously planned and executed, ensuring that the pace of progress was sustainable and organized. Soldiers, engineers, and local workers coordinated in ways that prioritized stability and efficiency, creating a rhythm of rebuilding that extended from cities to the countryside. Social reforms addressed long-standing inequalities and promoted human dignity. Land reforms redistributed property to farmers. Labor laws ensured fairer treatment, and public health initiatives addressed the lingering effects of wartime deprivation. Each policy required patience, careful implementation, and observation to ensure it took hold effectively. Communities adapted, slowly integrating these changes into their daily routines and gradually creating a society rebuilt on principles of resilience, fairness, and opportunity. Cultural recovery paralleled political and economic reforms. Artists, writers, and performers reflected on the war's impact through subtle expression, memorials, and storytelling. Communities preserved traditions while embracing new forms of cultural exchange and communication, blending reflection with quiet optimism for the future. Every act of cultural preservation, education, and civic participation contributed to the steady rhythm of societal rebuilding. By the end of this period, Japan had begun to transform from a nation devastated by war to a society slowly reclaiming order, stability, and hope. Cities and villages regained functionality. Citizens adapted to new systems, and the careful coordination of military, civilian, and international actors ensured that progress was deliberate and sustainable. Across the archipelago, the quiet persistence of recovery, reform, and cultural reflection created a foundation for the decades of peace and development that would follow.
Even after the formal end of hostilities, the world continued to reckon with the consequences of World War II. The Nuremberg trials stood as a landmark in international law, a measured yet profound effort to address the crimes committed during the conflict. In quiet, solemn courtrooms, judges, lawyers, and witnesses participated in proceedings that blended careful deliberation with the weight of history, establishing a new rhythm of accountability for the modern world. Leaders responsible for atrocities, genocide, and war crimes were presented before the courts. Evidence was reviewed with meticulous attention to detail. Testimony was recorded and examined, and legal arguments were considered with deliberation and care. The proceedings were deliberate and patient, reflecting both the complexity of the cases and the importance of ensuring justice was perceived as fair, thorough, and enduring. Civilians and soldiers alike followed the trials quietly, understanding that these proceedings extended beyond punishment. They symbolized a commitment to principles that transcended national boundaries: the value of human life, the importance of accountability, and the recognition that no one, regardless of power, could act with impunity. Across Europe and the world, nations engaged with the lessons of these trials, integrating reflection, remembrance, and dialogue into post-war societies. Beyond the courts, nations began to codify frameworks for preventing future conflict. International organizations, treaties, and cooperative agreements emerged from the careful study of wartime failures and successes. Diplomats and leaders engaged in measured negotiations, each decision informed by the quiet rhythm of observation, analysis, and strategic foresight. The goal was to create structures that would guide nations toward peaceful resolution, using the lessons of history as both guide and warning. The trials also affected cultural consciousness. Literature, journalism, art, and film reflected on the horrors of war, the courage of those who resisted, and the moral responsibilities of humanity. Memorials and museums preserved both the memory of the victims and the stories of those who survived. Communities held ceremonies and gatherings, establishing patterns of remembrance that balanced grief with resilience, reflection with hope. By the end of this period, the world had begun to integrate the principles of justice, accountability, and reflection into its daily and institutional rhythms. Cities, towns, and communities had reclaimed routines disrupted by war, but the lessons of Nuremberg, patient deliberation, careful observation, and unwavering attention to ethical responsibility remained embedded in global consciousness. Across continents, the quiet endurance of justice and reflection continued to shape societies, reminding humanity that the pursuit of peace and moral clarity is as essential as any military victory.
By the late 1940s, the world had entered a period of careful reconstruction, not only of cities and economies, but also of international institutions. The devastation of World War II had highlighted the need for global mechanisms to promote dialogue, peace, and cooperation.
The formation of the United Nations became a landmark achievement in this ongoing effort, a structured and deliberate attempt to create a platform where nations could resolve disputes, address shared challenges, and plan collaboratively for the future. Delegates from across the globe gathered in calm, purposeful meetings, negotiating charters, rules, and responsibilities. Each session was marked by careful attention to detail, patient deliberation, and a quiet understanding of the stakes involved. Decisions were measured, reflecting both the lessons learned from conflict and the shared desire to prevent similar devastation in the future. Diplomacy became a quiet rhythm, a steady cadence of observation, discussion, and compromise that contrasted with the noise of wartime strategy, but carried equal significance for the fate of millions. Across continents, nations rebuilt political structures to accommodate the new global framework. Constitutions were refined, governments stabilized, and regional alliances carefully strengthened. Even in small towns and rural communities, citizens gradually engaged with these changes through education, media, and civic participation, integrating the principles of cooperation, law, and dialogue into everyday life. Each act of engagement, no matter how small, contributed to the larger rhythm of post-war global stability. Economically, Reconstruction continued alongside political restructuring. International cooperation facilitated trade, resource distribution, and technical assistance. Countries collaborated to restore transportation networks, rebuild industrial capacity, and address the social needs of populations affected by war. Engineers, planners, and local communities worked together in a patient, methodical manner, ensuring that recovery was sustainable, balanced, and resilient. Culturally, the emphasis on reflection and international awareness grew. Schools incorporated global history and ethics into their curricula. Art, literature, and journalism reflected on shared human experiences, resilience, and the necessity of empathy and understanding across borders. Communities created memorials and museums that honored the past while promoting the lessons of cooperation and peaceful resolution. By the end of this period, the world had established a deliberate rhythm of international engagement. Through the creation of the United Nations and the careful coordination of global reconstruction, nations had laid the groundwork for dialogue, negotiation, and cooperation. Across cities, towns, and fields, the quiet persistence of rebuilding, learning, and collaboration shaped a new era, one where the echoes of conflict were met with patience, foresight, and the enduring hope that humanity could achieve stability and peace together.
By the late 1940s, the world's focus shifted from reconstruction to the quiet but profound emergence of new tensions. Europe, though slowly recovering, had been divided along political and ideological lines. Eastern Europe fell under the influence of the Soviet Union, while Western Europe aligned more closely with the democratic and economic interests of the United States and its allies. This division was subtle yet powerful, shaping the rhythm of international relations and influencing local communities across the continent. Across cities and towns, civilians experienced the effects of these emerging divisions. Borders,
Checkpoints and shifting allegiances became part of daily life. Families and communities adapted to new political realities with patience, endurance, and careful observation. Even simple acts, traveling from one town to another, receiving news, or participating in local governance, were informed by the broader context of tension, strategy, and the quiet interplay of power. Governments and diplomats engaged in careful, deliberate negotiation. Treaties, economic plans, and security measures were implemented to stabilize regions while subtly asserting influence. The Marshall Plan continued to provide aid to Western Europe, strengthening economies and infrastructure, while Eastern European countries adjusted to centrally planned policies and Soviet oversight. Each policy was executed with careful precision, balancing the need for recovery with the strategic considerations of a world increasingly divided along ideological lines. Military planning also reflected this new reality. Armies and navies were reorganized, and forces were strategically positioned to respond to potential conflicts. Exercises, intelligence gathering, and quiet mobilization became part of the rhythm of this emerging Cold War. Soldiers and strategists alike understood that vigilance and patience would define the coming decades, as open conflict could be avoided through careful planning, observation, and negotiation. Cultural and social life in both East and West reflected the larger tensions. Media, literature, and education emphasized resilience, awareness, and civic responsibility, often highlighting differences in ideology and values while encouraging reflection on shared human experiences. Communities preserved local traditions and history, subtly integrating lessons of endurance, cooperation, and reflection amidst a changing political landscape. By the end of this period, the quiet division of Europe had become a defining feature of the post-war world. Nations, communities, and individuals adapted to a rhythm of cautious observation, patient diplomacy, and strategic positioning. The Cold War, though largely absent of immediate battle, shaped daily life, international policy, and the collective consciousness of millions. Across cities, towns, and borders, the world learned to balance vigilance with recovery, tension with reflection, and the enduring hope for a stable and peaceful future. By the early 1950s, the world was quietly adjusting to the aftermath of World War II, not only in terms of politics and economy, but also through the subtle transformation of social and cultural life. Across continents, communities were being rebuilt from the remnants of destruction, while populations migrated in search of safety, opportunity, and stability. Every movement, every act of reconstruction carried with it the quiet rhythm of patience, endurance, and human resilience. Europe saw waves of migration as displaced persons returned to homelands, sought new homes, or reunited with families long separated by war. Cities, towns, and rural villages became hubs of resettlement, where infrastructure was repaired and homes gradually restored. Markets reopened, schools welcomed children again, and local life began to flow with a tentative yet steady rhythm. Each small act of rebuilding, repairing a roof, planting crops, or reopening a shop added to the collective momentum of recovery. In Asia, Countries affected by the Pacific Theater navigated similar transitions. Japan, under occupation, integrated reforms that slowly transformed political, economic, and social structures. Civilians resumed daily routines, communities worked together to restore local industries, and cultural institutions revived, preserving traditions while embracing new perspectives introduced by global exchange. Across the region, the quiet rhythm of resilience continued to shape society, blending reflection on the past with cautious optimism for the future. Migration also influenced the Americas, Africa, and the Middle East. Refugees, immigrants, and returning soldiers reshaped urban and rural landscapes, introducing new skills, cultural practices, and ways of life. Cities expanded cautiously, neighborhoods adapted to demographic shifts, and local economies absorbed these changes with careful attention. Every movement of people, every adjustment of community routines contributed to a broader, subtle pattern of post-war social transformation. Culturally, the post-war period was marked by reflection and creative renewal. Literature, music, theater, and visual arts explored themes of survival, memory, and resilience. Memorials and museums were established, offering spaces for contemplation and remembrance. Education emphasized civic responsibility, peace, and international awareness, preparing new generations to understand the complexities of history and the lessons of endurance. Communities, both large and small, incorporated these values into daily life, establishing traditions of remembrance and subtle reflection. By the end of this period, the world had entered a quiet, deliberate rhythm of social and cultural reconstruction. Families, neighborhoods, and entire nations rebuilt not only physical structures, but the social fabric that had been disrupted by war. Across continents, the human capacity for adaptation, reflection, and collaboration shaped the emerging post-war order, demonstrating that recovery, though slow and patient, was deeply resilient. The lessons of the past were woven into daily life, providing a foundation for peace, understanding, and continued growth in the decades to come.
By the early 1950s, the world was steadily moving into a new era of recovery and transformation. Economies that had been devastated by years of global conflict were gradually regaining strength. Factories reopened, railways and ports were repaired, and trade networks began to function with renewed efficiency. Across continents, the rhythm of production, transportation, and commerce returned, creating a steady pulse of daily life that reflected both endurance and optimism. One of the most remarkable social shifts during this period was the baby boom. Families, freed from the uncertainties of war, began to grow. Hospitals, schools, and neighborhoods adjusted to the rising number of children, creating new routines and infrastructures to support families. Parks and playgrounds filled with laughter, streets echoed with the quiet sounds of daily life, and communities gradually rebuilt a sense of continuity and stability. This era of growth carried with it both the resilience of past generations and the hope of a future defined by opportunity and prosperity. Technological advancements also reshaped societies in profound ways. Innovations in transportation, communication, and industry improved efficiency and connected distant regions more closely than ever before.
Cars, trains, and airplanes facilitated both commerce and migration. New energy sources and manufacturing methods transformed the production of goods. Television, radio, and print media began to circulate ideas, culture, and information with unprecedented speed, creating a shared rhythm of knowledge and awareness across communities. Economic recovery and technological progress were closely intertwined. Factories produced more efficiently. Urban areas expanded in response to growing populations, and trade networks allowed nations to exchange goods, skills, and ideas. Rural regions also benefited from infrastructure projects, electrification, and improved transportation, creating a gradual yet steady integration of communities into broader national and global systems. Every innovation, every restored facility, and every new product contributed to a quiet but persistent rhythm of progress. Culturally, societies reflected on the war and its aftermath while embracing new possibilities. Education emphasized science, technology, and civic responsibility, preparing younger generations for a changing world. Literature, film, and art explored both the horrors of the past and the promise of the future, encouraging reflection, empathy, and understanding. Communities established traditions of remembrance while celebrating renewal, blending the past and present into a rhythm of life that was both reflective and forward-looking. By the end of this period, the world had entered a steady rhythm of economic, technological, and social recovery. Families grew, industries expanded, and communities adapted to the new possibilities and challenges of the post-war era. Across cities, towns, and rural areas, the quiet persistence of human creativity, endurance, and cooperation shaped societies in ways that would define the mid-20th century. Life, though shaped by memory and reflection, moved forward with a cautious optimism, setting the stage for continued growth, innovation, and understanding.
By the early 1950s, the calm of post-war recovery was accompanied by the quiet tension of a new global conflict, the Cold War. Although the world had largely avoided large-scale warfare since 1945, ideological, political, and military rivalries between the United States and its allies in the West and the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc shaped daily life, diplomacy, and international strategy. The division of Europe, the reconstruction of Asia, and the management of global influence all reflected this delicate balance, where patient observation and careful planning often replaced open combat. The Korean Peninsula became a focal point of these tensions. In 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel into the south, initiating a conflict that quickly drew in both American-led United Nations forces and Chinese troops. Soldiers moved through rugged mountains, icy rivers, and dense forests, each step dictated by strategy, endurance, and cautious observation. The rhythm of the campaign was deliberate and measured, as commanders balanced logistics, reinforcements, and tactical decisions in an environment shaped by both geography and global politics. Civilians in Korea experienced the slow but persistent effects of conflict.
Families moved cautiously, seeking safety in villages or temporary shelters. Markets, schools, and workplaces adapted to shifting circumstances, maintaining the quiet patterns of daily life wherever possible. Each small act of survival and resilience contributed to the overall rhythm of endurance, reflecting the broader human capacity to continue amidst uncertainty. Globally, nations adjusted to the new geopolitical order. Europe remained divided, with NATO in the west and the Warsaw Pact forming in the east. Diplomatic negotiations, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning unfolded in quiet, measured patterns, influencing local and international decisions. The goal was not open confrontation, but careful positioning and influence, each decision executed with patience, observation, and foresight. Technological and military developments continued to shape the period. Nuclear weapons, missile technology, and air power became central to strategy, while conventional forces remained essential for rapid deployment. Economies adapted to these new realities, investing in infrastructure, industry, and education to support defense and technological growth. Communities, aware of the broader stakes, incorporated lessons of vigilance, preparedness, and international awareness into daily life. By the end of this period, the world had entered a rhythm defined by caution, strategic patience, and reflection. The Korean conflict, while geographically distant for many, symbolized the broader tensions of the Cold War. Across continents, nations and individuals adapted to the reality of a divided world, balancing reconstruction and prosperity with vigilance and careful planning. Life moved forward quietly, guided by the lessons of endurance, strategy, and the hope that peaceful solutions could coexist alongside the necessary preparedness for conflict.
As the world settled into the mid-20th century, the quiet echoes of World War II continued to shape every continent, city, and community. The war had been a period of unparalleled challenge, destruction, and endurance, and its legacy lingered in both tangible and intangible ways. Across oceans, fields, towns, and cities, the rhythms of life had resumed, but beneath the surface, lessons of strategy, resilience, and human perseverance remained deeply embedded. Communities rebuilt slowly but steadily. Streets were repaved, homes reconstructed, and schools reopened to nurture the generations that would inherit the world shaped by this conflict. Markets and industries returned to function, transportation networks restored, and communication systems once disrupted by warfare gradually regained their rhythm. Civilians and soldiers alike contributed to this process with quiet diligence, patience, and determination, ensuring that the recovery was both sustainable and meaningful. The human cost of the war remained a constant, quiet reflection. Families remembered those lost, veterans adjusted to life after service, and entire nations grappled with the trauma and upheaval of years of global conflict. Memorials, museums, and educational programs ensured that the stories of sacrifice, endurance, and courage were preserved for future generations. Through reflection and remembrance,
societies reinforced the values of justice, empathy, and the responsibility to prevent future tragedies. Globally, the political and social structures established after the war shaped decades to come. The United Nations, international treaties, and cooperative frameworks provided mechanisms to resolve disputes peacefully. Nations adapted to a world divided by ideology, yet the lessons of World War II underscored the importance of dialogue, observation, and careful strategic planning. Even in times of tension, communities and leaders drew upon the experiences of the past to guide measured, thoughtful decisions. Technological and cultural transformations also carried forward the war's legacy. Innovations in medicine, industry, transportation, and communication accelerated development and connected communities in new ways. Literature, art, film, and scholarship continued to explore the profound experiences of the conflict, emphasizing endurance, moral responsibility, and the power of human determination. These reflections became part of the quiet rhythm of daily life, reminding societies of both the fragility and resilience of civilization. Life, though scarred and tested, continued in a steady, reflective rhythm, carrying forward the wisdom, resilience, and hope forged in the years of global struggle.